All right, I think we're ready to get started here. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Joshua Matheny, the CEO of Smart Training. We're excited to be able to share a little of our passion for training development with you today. When it comes to training development, I don't know of anyone more knowledgeable than today's presenter. We've got Jim Moore. To that end, I'll tell you just a little bit about Jim. Newsweek magazine called Jim a maverick among mavericks, and Jim's life and career have certainly been unconventional. Jim is the best-selling author of 14 books, including a controversial 1990 work on the Kennedy assassination and the first Bill Clinton biography. He's appeared on nearly 800 radio and television programs, including 48 Hours, the CBS Evening News, and Larry King Live, and has been mentioned in more than 30 other books. Radio talk show pioneer Bert Lee called Jim Moore the most charismatic nonfiction author in America. Jim has spent his entire adult life in personal and professional development, including 25 years as development director, communications director, and executive director for Success Motivation International, and 24 years with Dallas-based Smart Training. Former General Motors Vice President Darwin Clark calls Jim Moore the best organizational facilitator I've ever seen. Jim holds degrees in history and political science from Arkansas Tech University and lives in Russellville, Arkansas. And with that, I'll turn the time over to you, Jim.
Well, Josh, thanks. And hi, everybody. Welcome to this first in a 3-webinar series where we, as Josh said a moment ago, share a little bit of our passion about training. And we'll begin today with a fact, at least I think most of us think of it as a fact, that training just has a bad reputation from a from a pure application standpoint. There are very few occupations today that will allow you to start work without some sort of training. And in some settings, that training is still conducted informally. Quite often, there's one worker showing another how to complete a task. But as the complexity of the modern world erodes the sheer number of manual labor jobs where this sort of training is applicable, that scenario is fast becoming outmoded and outdated. Now, in many large organizations, particularly around the United States, but also worldwide, we see batches of new hires being trained at once in classes or gatherings that are still led by a live instructor. And this is a time-tested method. It's still in use because it's proven it works, but it's also often the way that training has always been done, and no one sees the need to change it. And of course, the live in-person training provides some degree of job security for the person doing the training, and you can't ever discount that. In a growing number of companies, however, just-in-time training and new employee training are delivered online, and a training presentation can be created just once and then delivered hundreds or thousands of times. So if your company hasn't yet joined the ranks of enterprises offering e-learning, then you face the very real challenge of continuing to present outdated, outmoded, and in some cases, flatly ineffective training to new employees. So the bottom line here as we begin today is this: if team members really are your most valuable asset, then perhaps you should ask yourself why you're not training them to fulfill that sort of expectation. Now, all of us suffer from some degree of training fatigue, for lack of a better word. To say that the team members dread training is not an exaggeration. It's unfortunately the unvarnished truth. But the reason that team members dread training is because trainers are offering less than their best. Team members often find it hard to become excited by mediocrity, and frankly, you can't blame them. In many enterprises, training is entertainment. It's boring entertainment, but it's entertainment nonetheless, because the enterprise attaches no more value to training than that, which frankly is a serious mistake. Training isn't entertainment, and it isn't inspiration, motivation, or preparation. Training serves one purpose: to get team members to think, act, and react in a given or more appropriate way. And during our time together today, we'll talk about the elements of highly effective training, talk about the various delivery methodologies and some of the limitations they have, and we'll discuss why most training fails to achieve the purpose for which it was developed. Now, I'm the first to admit that all this is pretty heady stuff, made all the more so because there's no wise old man who knows all about training. I've been in the training and development industry all my adult life, and even after nearly 40 years, I'm still learning something new every day. At Smart Training, we've been fortunate to develop a training methodology that works. And so our goal over these 3 webinars is to share the nuts and bolts of that methodology with you. So let's discuss the 5 characteristics of highly effective training engagements. If the training you are offering does not meet these 5 criteria, then odds are it's not especially effective. But right out of the blocks, these criteria are hard to achieve, so a bit of fair warning in advance. First, effective training is always captivating. Typically, trainers who don't captivate their audience don't train on much of anything. The training they present is almost always reduced to just entertainment. Effective training is always concise. Now, we'll dwell on this point presently, but this is often the stumbling block for live training. Trainers are so caught up in themselves and the sheer genius of their own presentations that they spend far more time than necessary to communicate simple or straightforward concepts. Third, effective training is always focused on need. Just-in-time training is a buzzword for this reason. To do the most good, training should be offered so that it can be immediately used. And there's scarcely a case to be made for training a new employee on a skill they'll need a year or 2 down the road. Good training is always focused on an almost immediate application of information. Now, captivating training is always entertaining, but uninspired training, not so much. Even sophisticated trainees, long-term employees, shouldn't be nodding off during training presentations. We appreciate what we enjoy, and we find ourselves learning more than we ever thought possible from an entertaining interlude with someone who knows what they're talking about. But the real trick, folks, as we'll discuss in a moment, is limiting the information communicated via training to the essential elements only. Effective training always focuses on the barest minimum of information that must be communicated in order to achieve a desired result. So, with respect to developing highly effective training, there's a harsh truth to absorb, and that is this: delivery methodologies don't make a difference. In other words, we can develop effective training to be delivered live and in person, captivating training that can be shared one-to-one, or genuinely empowering training that is developed and delivered via a learning management system. The delivery methodology itself doesn't make or break the content. So the message here is crystal clear. The typical live training interludes are not better because they're live. That's the point we want to make. But we need to keep 2 other things in mind. The first is this: 62% of all new ideas are accepted, internalized, and acted upon only after they've been presented to us at least a half dozen times. This is a learning concept called spaced repetition, and it's been validated by countless educators and advertisers since time immemorial. If you grew up in an American school system, you had the multiplication tables drilled into you during elementary school, and that's the reason that you instantly know that 7 times 7 is 49. But if somebody stops you and asks you the product of 17 times 17, you have to grab your phone or use a calculator somewhere, because the multiplication table stopped at 12 times 12. So spaced repetition works, but 12 times 12 was as far as most of us got. The fundamental truth is that to be usable, ideas and information must be repeated at least a half dozen times. Any good training delivery methodology must incorporate spaced repetition. The spacing in terms of time is relatively unimportant, but that's why compliance training in particular is repeated at regular intervals. So now we ask the question, why does most training fail? Well, in a word, Training often fails because those who develop or present the training are often more focused on impressing their audience than they are with communicating useful information. Many live trainers are still in the training business today because they cannot get their ego strokes in any other way. That's unfortunate, but it's very true. I've met a good many of them. Remember that we're training in order to influence actions and not to cultivate good opinion or impress other people. Years ago, when I started my first job in the training industry, my boss told me, "Spare me your brilliance for the first 6 months." If I close my eyes, I can still picture him saying those words. He understood, just as countless other training professionals understand, that if you spare your audience your brilliance, your training stands a better chance. So restrict your content to what I call essential elements only. In the compliance field, for example, no one really wants or needs to know the history behind certain federal regulations. We may mention an active date from time to time, but the etymology of the law itself weighs very little when we're trying to change workplace behavior. And yet many of our clients want us to bore their employees with the background of the law, which I always contend doesn't really matter much. The content of training should influence actions. And even though I'm a historian, I'm the first to tell you that a history lesson very seldom does that. So if you ask yourself what you want to communicate and why, you'll be in a much better position to develop any kind of training intervention. The sad fact, however, is that most trainers plunge in and begin developing content without giving much thought to the end result. And unfortunately for them, the end result, which is changing actions and attitudes and behavior, is all that really matters. So let's go back to our discussion of captivating training. Multimedia is our friend. Even stand-up trainers who train live will acknowledge that fact. Multimedia is our friend because it is an attention getter. Even if you look just like Brad Pitt or Jennifer Lopez, your audience begins to tire of you in less than 5 minutes. Now, back in the pre-digital era, speakers learned to use overhead projectors. That was all the multimedia we had for years and years. Nowadays, of course, our media sources are limited only by our imagination. Thankfully, the days of lugging a large monitor from one presentation to another are gone as well. I've done that plenty of times. That's not to say that you can't develop and deliver captivating and purposeful training without some sort of multimedia support. But you'd better be what we used to call a speech wizard, and there are few people alive who actually possess that skill. Most of us find that captivating people through our platform presence or via the sound of our voice will take us a few minutes into a training presentation, but not much more than that. So what types of media work? Well, imagery is still the best go-to choice, if for no other reason than the technical requirements for displaying imagery are now fairly easily mastered. Be sure the images you use are sharp, clear, and convey a message. If you have to add a dialogue or wording to some sort of an image to get it to communicate what you want, then find another image. Now, video is certainly a captivating tool, and in some cases, it's extremely instructional, but it's also limited because of the expense involved in buying or creating it, and frankly, by the technical expertise required to display it properly. So if you embed a video into a training presentation, be sure you understand what I call your lowest common denominator. Most of us have something better than dial-up internet access, but not everyone can stream decent quality video at a frame rate that doesn't invoke frustration. If you've ever waited on a movie or a television program to buffer, you'll have experienced that firsthand. So don't create training that requires technical sophistication to access or view. Now, as important as media is, when and how you use media is a vital consideration, because media cannot do heavy lifting for you. If you haven't fully developed your training presentation, it's unlikely that you can find sufficient media to muscle your ideas into the hearts and the brains of those you're training. So what can do the heavy lifting if the media cannot? The answer is quite literally as old as recorded civilization itself. In the training equation, straightforward writing, it's worth its weight in gold. Keep an eye on your word count and remember that the normal human speech pattern is about 125 words a minute. So brevity is key. If you're creating a slide presentation, any slide on which there's content should contain about half that word count or less. I always strive for 60 words or less on any slide I'm developing. And sometimes you have to be very creative to figure out a way to shoehorn information that you need into a single slide. But quite often the best tendency is to use another slide. I've seen so many presentations in which people have crowded slides with words to the point that they're difficult to read. I think 60 words is sort of the sweet spot. Only use bullet points if you're providing some sort of recorded narration. Otherwise, bullet points make comprehension more difficult. And similarly, you have to choose your words carefully. Unless the training you're offering requires its own vocabulary, don't use words that complicate what you're trying to say. When in doubt, ask someone to read through what you've written before you set up the presentation. And let me dwell on that point for just a minute. A knowledgeable, objective editor is well worth finding and cultivating. And they don't have to be a professional editor, but somebody who will read through your stuff and determine whether or not you're hitting the target. The simple reason is that you are already familiar with the material upon which your training is based, and an editor can spot weaknesses in your presentation that might not be apparent to you, but would be apparent to someone less familiar with the content. Finally, let's remember the KISS acronym, keep it super simple. That's what that stands for in the training context. Don't try for complicated presentation design. Use animations sparingly and keep a close eye on the word count. If you don't, the word count will creep up, and you'll have an overly wordy presentation that is neither captivating nor effective. So how you write and the content you choose to include speaks so loudly that it often obscures what you want to communicate. That's why we always say, what you say doesn't count. How you say it is far more important. If you watch news on television, you'll see veteran news people communicating far more with their inflection and their body language than they do with the content they write. Now, YouTubers and journalism newbies, on the other hand, are almost always myopically focused on what they write or say. And the current social media video delivery trends are a marked departure from video delivery a generation ago. And I don't mean that in a good way. Another critical point to remember is that simple sentences sell. Remember when we talked about the speech wizards a few moments ago? Great trainers are seldom speech wizards. Instead, they focus on getting a concept or an idea across with a bare minimum of words. Brevity is an art. You have to practice to manage a constant economy of words. Even more important than brevity, however, is the style of writing you employ. In any training delivery methodology, the ear is the dominant sense. Now, most trainers write for the eye, and they cram every possible word into their delivery. And this is a big mistake for a couple of important reasons. First, if you assume your audience is preoccupied, fatigued, or generally indisposed to wading through a textbook, you'll immediately understand why most won't absorb your training message. Second, reading all that text requires effort, while listening requires almost none. All that the listener requires is a conscious mind. So our aim is to create training that is engaging but brief. And this sounds like a simple process, but it's inordinately complicated. There are 3 prerequisites to creating brief but engaging training. First, know what you need to communicate. Know the audience to whom you're speaking and speak at their level. Years ago, we had a client who wanted to include and I know Josh remembers this, wanted to include a physics lesson in the middle of a sales training he wanted us to develop. And I found that I couldn't easily dissuade him from that. He finally went to another company who would develop the training just as he wanted it. The moral of the story, though, harkens back to our first moments together when I told you that you have to get your ego out of the way of the training proposition altogether. You might argue that my ego is still very much involved since we turned away paid work, but we turned away paid work that would not achieve results. If you want your training to achieve results, you'll need to know precisely what you want to communicate. And impressing your audience is not, despite what many trainers think, is not the overriding goal. I drink iced tea because it's a Southern product. I used to go to hot springs when I was a kid, Josh, and watch those poor, ignorant Southerners selling water to brilliant Yankees, and it always made such an impression on me. We'll talk more about the need for a narrated presentation in a moment, but for right now, remember that brevity is not a sign that you lack intelligence. Actually, it's quite opposite. You have to really think through communication challenges if you want to reduce them to their barest essence and limit how much you say. Now, I'm going to relate a personal anecdote here, something that I would not normally do in a training presentation, but I'm doing this to make a point because this was one of the most valuable lessons I've ever learned. My hobby for the past 3 decades has been British double-decker buses. I've actually owned 4 of the real things, including a London Routemaster bus. That's the hop-on, hop-off kind you see so often in the movies. When I brought my Routemaster over from Britain, I hired an Irish busman to come teach me how to drive it because driving a bus for pleasure was new to me. And unlike American vehicles, many British cars and trucks and buses do not have self-canceling turn signals. When you turn your turn signal on in your car, once you've turned the corner, the turn signal automatically stops. Well, in Britain, the vehicles don't do that. So learning to drive my Routemaster, I had to remember to reach up and turn the signal off after I'd completed the turn. The British call this an indicator, and you'll almost always see someone barreling down the motorway with an indicator blazing because they've made the same sort of error. My instructor, the Irishman, patiently reminded me to turn the indicator off, saying there was no need to advertise that I was an amateur. And the more I thought about that sentence, the more sense it made. So I started thinking about all the other areas of my life where my behavior might advertise that I was an amateur. And one of those was public speaking. Now, I grew up in radio and I was accustomed to speaking to groups, but from time to time, I would allow my thoughts to wander, my monologue to pause, and a one-syllable word would creep into my speech pattern. And you all know what that word is. It's We all do it, but we can train ourselves not to say I sat in church this past Sunday and listened to a man speak for less than 5 minutes. And during that time, he said 435 times. I counted them. If you cannot string more than 2 words together at a time, as this gentleman obviously could not, then you really cannot afford the luxury of as you decide your next syllable. So even if you're going to record your training presentation, practice is key. Practice what you're going to say until you know when you'll say it, what you'll say, and how. If you fail to practice, you quite literally practice to fail. Which,
Jim,
Josh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So there's a question here if there's room for abbreviations and symbols and content writing, how those really play in.
Well, you see a lot of that in amateur training, and the problem is that they complicate comprehension. The mind has to think through what the symbol represents before it can continue on through the rest of the content. The big no-no to me are ampersands, the and sign. And I also see people abbreviating et cetera, quite often wrong, or the wrong abbreviation, but they have et cetera, abbreviated in a slide. And my thought is, if you don't want to write out your message, then don't allude to it. And if you can't make the extra 2 keystrokes to type out and, then something's really wrong.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move ahead if we can. That brings us to the choice of presentation software. I have never been a big fan, I confess, of apps like PowerPoint and Keynote because they cloud the message as often as they accentuate it. Now, the slide title probably overstates the point, but I have seen some terrific training presentations ruined by an over-reliance on software. That's because presentation software improperly used can dilute your message or confuse your audience. Remember this axiom: effects aren't content, and vice versa. Content aren't effects or isn't effects. Animations and other effects will not substitute for lackluster content or for no content at all. No matter how much you want to rely on the presentation package, it cannot do the heavy lifting for you. The GIGO acronym is still valid: garbage in, garbage out. Instead, look for ways to put your content front and center. And this can be a revealing exercise if you don't have the right content or have enough of it. Do yourself and your audience a favor and learn a little about the software you're intending to use, because what I've found is that a little knowledge goes a long way. Now, whether in an online offering or in an actual class, you can easily learn slide design basics, animation and impact, topography and slides, and crafting visual appeal. My dad was a very well-known commercial artist, and I've always been grateful that he taught me topography basics because they've paid big dividends over the last 4 decades of my life. But some of these elements, like good design, are lifelong pursuits. You can make a good start, though, in just a few hours. Spend some time looking at other presentations. That's a slight edge. Decide what looks you like and then try to emulate them. So with all this talk about presentations and software, we have to ask, is there still a place for live training? The future is an emphatic yes, but only in special situations. For example, the kinds of skills training that we discussed early on in our time together is probably still best done live. If you're still training live, though, consider the advantages of moving your training online via the Smart Training LMS. You no longer have to replicate the training experience ad infinitum. It's there for as long as you need it and whenever you need it. Online training also brings about some key advantages, including consistency, accountability via quizzes and other kinds of interactions, and genuine time savings as well. However, that doesn't mean that everyone is going to be in love with the idea right away, because old training habits die hard. Once you see the features and the capabilities of a fully developed learning management system, though, it is difficult to understand why the old way might still work as well as it could. So that's where companies like Smart Training can actually help you make the transition to e-delivery, because we can help repackage your existing training, add missing elements like narration and slide design, or just give you the benefit of another eye on your work. The basic problem, for many of us anyway, is that we cannot fit ourselves into a laptop. There's no way to package our intellect and passion and make it work for us. Instead, we have to know how to make the laptop and presentation software work in our favor. And that requires some time, certainly, but the real expense is effort. You can't shortcut the effort required to learn a new skill. If you try, I predict to you that the new skill will continue to elude you. If you're currently delivering training presentations, try adding a voice track. Narration helps push training along, and it also works to ensure that your message doesn't become an over-the-counter sleep aid by virtue of something we call multi-sensory impact. Last week, I took a look at some client training that was still PowerPoint-based and deathly silent. When the text on the slide sets the pace for a module, then you've effectively set the stage for boredom. Visuals, especially slides crowded with text, are no longer enough. You have to capture and keep attention in the process. And that's why narration is such a terrific aid to comprehension. But you have to approach narration like a professional. You can't just grab your cell phone and sit at your desk and dictate a memo to yourself and use it in your training. Before you narrate anything, or before you do a webinar or a live presentation, warm up your voice and body. Professional athletes have a warm-up period before any competition. And believe me, training is a genuine competition. When you're delivering training, you're always competing for attention. Now, believe it or not, I have never made a presentation that isn't canned. I've been on radio and television shows all around the world, and I've always known what I would say next. So when in doubt, script it out. That task is certainly time-consuming, but it is almost always worthwhile. Being in front of 15 million people helps you appreciate the need for knowing what you're going to say. Invest in a decent quality microphone. Many of the microphones, by the way, that are used for podcasting today aren't much better than using your cell phone. So do a little homework. I'm using an Audio-Technica 4040 at the moment. It's the best basic, affordable, all-around microphone I've ever found. But you also need a small USB interface that will allow you to connect the mic to your computer. And be sure to talk across the front of the mic, not directly into it. You address the mic sideways, not head on. If you try narrating a training presentation, it'll give you a very quick glimpse of how you actually perform. So let's remember, audio quality counts. Don't expect to record your narration in a crowded room or another noisy environment. Although many people do, it does not work well. Find someplace quiet where your listeners don't hear cars, trains, or other people in the background. Then the audio that you capture will generate a waveform, something that looks like an electronic heartbeat on an EKG machine. And you'll need some basic software to enhance the audio files and edit out the bits that will form the narration for your slides. This is, quite frankly, something that's more easily understood when you try it. And there are several free editing software packages out there if you wanted to practice. In the early days of our company, for example, we used Audacity, which I think is still available. When all else fails, you can turn to Fiverr, to your local broadcast outlet, or to a disc jockey for some quality narration. If you don't have the pipes that are required, then reaching out is easy enough. So once you have your voice track edited out and embedded in your PowerPoint, you need a platform on which to deliver your training. And that's where the Smart Training LMS really shines. In all my years in the industry, ours is the most full-featured LMS I've ever seen. Our goal is to make uplifting and uploading your existing training presentations a piece of cake. We've created what I'm fond of calling a push-button upload. It's an almost foolproof process that gets your training up and available. Now, Josh Matheny, our CEO, who introduced me a few moments ago, will be here on March 31st to demo the LMS. So if you're excited about what we've shared so far, you won't want to miss Josh at the end of March, because he will focus on the actual upload process, and you can see for yourself how simple it really is. Now, once your presentation is ready to go, you'll have either the LMS features at your disposal, and you can see who's been trained and how they did. You can assign new training to folks already in the system. The entire way, we are there to help you and support your efforts. The entire Smart Training team is invested in your success, and we are literally a phone call or an email away. So if you have questions about how the whole Smart Training process works, I highly recommend the March 31st webinar. Meanwhile, if you have questions, feel free to contact us. The number is on the screen. My extension is 508. My email address is there in front of you as well. I try to respond to emails the same day, and if I can, the same hour. So if something I've said sparks a deeper conversation or some interest on your part, why, feel free to email me. That just about wraps it from the Smart Training digs, and good thing too, because I can hear a train coming in over my shoulder right now. So let's take a moment to answer any questions or concerns that you might have, and then we'll see everyone back here on March 31st. Josh?
Thanks, Jim. Really appreciate the presentation. And hopefully that answered a few questions about what you guys might have of how you create your next training course. As mentioned, I'll be presenting this upcoming month, a couple weeks, at the end of the month, and it'll be focused on the Smart Training uploading process. Although don't let that scare you away. A lot of those same principles apply to any online learning platform that you may already be using. So if you're happy with what you've got, still come and visit us, and we'll just go through a couple of best practices that we've learned over the last 20 years of moving our content online. So I haven't seen any questions come through yet, but if there are any questions, please go ahead and type them out, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Josh, thanks for the time.
Yep, it looks like you did a good job presenting, because we're not getting any questions. So we'll wrap up right now, and we appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you all soon. Bye.